Breaking news today, the son of Ryan Routh, the man in custody for the second apparent assassination attempt against former President Trump, has been arrested on federal charges of possessing child pornography. Orrin Alexander Routh was arrested today, according to court documents. Investigators say they found hundreds of child pornography files when searching Orrin Routh's home in North Carolina. It is unclear if the investigation was in relation to his father. The files were found on a Samsung Galaxy Note device inside Orrin's primary bedroom. As of now, a preliminary hearing has not been scheduled, and he has not entered a plea. The Pentagon announced additional U.S. troops will be sent to the Middle East. The new deployments come as fears of an all-out war could break out between Israel and Hezbollah. Both sides traded fire this week, and Israel carried out strikes on 1,500 targets throughout Lebanon and rocking Beirut in just the past 24 hours. The death toll has climbed to at least 550 people and forced thousands to flee their homes in southern Lebanon. Today, President Biden addressed the UN General Assembly for the final time as president, having this to say about the ongoing conflict in the region.
Now is the time for the parties to finalize its terms. Bring the hostages home. A full-scale war is not in anyone's interest, even if the situation has escalated.
Joining me now is The Hill's White House reporter, Brett Samuels. Brett, it's great to see you. Obviously, a consequential speech for the president, foreign policy, a major, or what his supporters would say is a big strength of his. What else did he have to say in this speech?
Yeah, it was certainly an interesting speech because, like you said, Julia, foreign policy is something that President Biden's very comfortable with. It's sort of been a bedrock for him going back to when he was a senator. Obviously, this time around, it's his last speech as president to the United Nations. There was sort of this almost somber, reflective tone. He closed by saying, that there are more important things than remaining in power and holding on to power, which was certainly a notable message coming from the president to this room full of world leaders, including some autocrats, you could say. But obviously, the conflict in the Middle East, the conflict in Ukraine, both top of mind. President Biden made sure to address both of those. He really urged world leaders to stay the course in supporting Ukraine. And as we heard from the president, warning against the possibility of a wider conflict in the Middle East.
Yeah, obviously, like I said, consequential because he's only in office for really a few more months, and all of this is happening, so definitely a busy time for the president. So Pentagon Press Secretary Major General Pat Ryder made the announcement that a small number of U.S. troops will be sent to the Middle East amid the ongoing risk of a greater regional war. Brett, do you think the U.S. could potentially be pulled into a wider conflict in the region?
Yeah, certainly I think that's one of the concerns here for folks is whether this war expands and what that would mean for U.S. involvement. Right now, I don't think there's, an urgent or imminent sort of risk of the U.S. being pulled in as far as troops on the ground or anything like that. Certainly, I think it's notable that the Pentagon is sending more troops, putting more forces in the area. I think that's a sign that they are trying to do what they can to warn, all sides here against further escalation. But the Pentagon hasn't really provided much detail on what these troops will be doing, where they'll be going, what they'll be doing. So at this point, I don't think there's much cause to think that there will be U.S. troops on the ground here, but certainly bears watching how this sort of plays out in the region and whether this becomes a wider conflict.
We'll be watching for more developments as the story develops. So on the campaign trail, former President Trump is in Georgia today, his campaign focusing on a get out the vote strategy. So Brett, this was a state that he lost in 2020, obviously contested those results, but in terms of this get out the vote strategy, will this work in Georgia where Democrats have really worked to mobilize key constituencies?
Yeah, it's interesting. So this Trump campaign strategy, they're trying something a little different this time. In the past cycles, the way the get out the vote strategy would work is the RNC, the Republican National Committee, would basically do a top-down approach. They would lead the charge. They'd try and knock on as many doors as possible, contact as many voters as possible. What the Trump campaign is doing differently this time is they're relying a bit on these outside groups. One is backed by Elon Musk. One is Turning Point USA, which is Charlie Kirk's conservative group. And the Trump campaign is hoping that those groups can help contact these voters in states like Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, these battleground states. So like you mentioned, Georgia is a state where turnout is going to be a huge deal. Obviously, Democrats are trying to turn out a lot of suburban voters, a lot of black voters, women voters. And former President Trump obviously holding a rally in Savannah today, going back to a state that really, you could argue he needs to win if he's going to return to the White House, he needs to win the state in November. Was decided by just about 11,000 votes in 2020. So certainly, I think we'll be looking back on Election Day and looking at this get out the vote strategy as sort of a key factor in whether Trump is able to get over the hump and turn Georgia back into his column.
So speaking of states that Trump needs to be in and that he was recently in, he was in Pennsylvania this week and made a direct appeal to women voters in particular. Let's take a listen.
You will no longer be in danger. You're not going to be in danger any longer. You will no longer have anxiety from all of the problems our country has today. You will be protected, and I will be your protector. Women will be happy, healthy, confident, and free. You will no longer be thinking about abortion. So all they talk about, abortion.
I will be your protector. That's an interesting line. But look, on that question about abortion, he says all they talk about is abortion, meaning Democrats. But look, this is an issue that Democrats have been successful in. I mean, we were supposed to see a red wave nationwide in 2022, but we saw more of a blue wave in a way because of this issue. So, does he stand a chance on this, with women voters? Obviously, abortion is not the only issue, but does he stand a chance with this messaging we just listened to?
Yeah, it's interesting because on the one hand, the whole argument from the Trump campaign is that women voters are concerned about the economy, they're concerned about immigration, they're concerned about crime and security, and those are issues where former President Trump and his campaign feel like he has the upper hand. So that's their argument, is on those issues, he's good for women, women should support him and come into his campaign. The problem, or part of the problem, is that he uses rhetoric like this. He speaks about women. He says, "I'll be your protector," which certainly turns off some women voters. He says that you shouldn't have to worry about abortion. Abortion's a non-issue now, which certainly will turn off a lot of women voters who look around the country and see these restrictive abortion bans going into place in states across the country. Like you said, Democrats in the Harris campaign have made abortion very central to their messaging. They're trying to remind women voters that Donald Trump is responsible for some of these abortion bans that we're seeing. So, Trump ultimately, polling has shown that he's underwater with women. Vice President Harris, one of her strengths is with women voters. So, certainly it's interesting to hear Trump sort of address them directly and try to make this direct outreach to a group that his campaign knows that he has some shortcomings with.
And I want to stick with that issue of abortion because Vice President Harris called for eliminating the legislative filibuster in the Senate to codify abortion rights during an interview on Wisconsin radio. Brett, when we talk about the filibuster, I think oftentimes the right comes, or the political right, I should say, comes back and say, look, this is an appeal to the left to galvanize Democrats and more liberal-leaning voters. But what is the chances of this actually happening in the upper chamber?
Yeah, I think slim, to put it bluntly, if not less than slim. We've seen, President Biden, for example, he previously called for, the Senate to get rid of the filibuster to pass voting rights legislation. That went nowhere, even though Democrats had a majority at the time, though it was a 50-50 majority, with Harris being the tie-breaking vote as vice president. We saw President Biden call for a carve-out to the filibuster in 2022 to restore abortion rights after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. That didn't go anywhere. They're just, the Senate's going to be a very narrow majority if Democrats even have the majority. And it's just not clear that there are enough even Democratic senators who are interested in getting rid of the filibuster because of this concern about, if one side gets rid of the filibuster, what does that mean the other side can do? That would just allow one side to pass with a simple majority legislation they want. So Democrats are already, having to defend Senate seats in Montana, Ohio, West Virginia, Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin. And, so even if Democrats are able to retain their very small majority, it just doesn't seem likely that they'll have the support to get rid of the filibuster, even though this is something that Vice President Harris has signaled she might push for if she's elected.
I want to move to a different issue, this time more on trade and economics. While speaking in Pennsylvania, Trump talked about renewing threats of tariffs against John Deere. Obviously, in a state like that, the blue wall, this really matters. What's behind those threats, and what else did he say?
Yeah, certainly, tariffs have been sort of the buzzword for former President Trump. Pretty much any economic issue you can think of that he gets asked about, he comes back to tariffs. He talks about tariffs as sort of a blanket solution to lowering costs, to bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. So this is sort of a message he's leaning into, this idea of using tariffs as, almost like a leverage, a piece of leverage essentially, to say, if John Deere, for example, big company manufactures tractors, lawnmowers, big machinery, that if John Deere, as they have said they're going to do by 2026, moves some of their manufacturing to Mexico, Trump will hit him with a tariff, and his idea is that that will force them to stay in the U.S. The problem is that economists, and as Democrats like to point out, economists say that a tariff is essentially just a tax that companies will pass on the cost to consumers. So economists have warned that this could worsen inflation, but Trump doesn't seem to be bothered by that. He's really leaning into this tariff messaging. He threatened John Deere, as we saw in his speech in Georgia today. He again returned to tariffs, said he's going to use tariffs to encourage or essentially force companies to manufacture here in the U.S. So certainly we'll hear more about tariffs from Trump between now and Election Day. The question is whether that's a message that resonates with voters.
So, Brett, we see Trump leaning into a lot of these issues on the campaign trail, speaking in a number of swing states. He's also done some interviews with, arguably friendlier outlets, friendlier interviewers. But the question everyone in Washington, I think in many parts of the country, are asking, is he going to accept a second presidential debate with Kamala Harris, the vice president? Alex Gangitano, our colleague, and I did a lot of reporting yesterday and chatted with a number of Republicans, a number of former Trump advisors who say absolutely he should. He missed an opportunity during that last debate, but he seems dead set on not doing this. Any insight? I mean, I know that neither of us are inside Donald Trump's head, but is he going to accept, or is no the final answer?
Yeah, right now he seems pretty set on not accepting a second debate. He, at one of his recent rallies, he said, the early voting has already started in some states, and so for that reason, it's too late to do another debate. He feels like he won the debate in early September, even though a lot of polling and analysis has suggested otherwise, that Vice President Harris won that debate. He feels like he won that debate. There's no reason for him to do another debate in October, closer to the election. With that being said, as you and our colleague Alex reported, a lot of his advisors, a lot of Republicans feel like, it would be in his best interest to take the stage again closer to Election Day, get this huge audience of millions of Americans watching. The argument is, for him doing is essentially that the first debate couldn't have gone much worse for him as far as getting off topic, falling into these traps that Vice President Harris set for him to get off topic, that he'll be more focused the second time around, and that will be a more lasting impression before voters head to the polls. But, as someone who you talked to for that story said, one of the arguments against is whether he can get a fair shake,
right,
whether he would agree to any of these outlets who are offering to host a debate, whether the moderators would be acceptable to him. So, on top of Trump seeming unwilling to do it, there's also the question of whether the two sides could come to some kind of agreement as far as, would CNN be an acceptable host, which moderators, which rules, et cetera. So just a lot of roadblocks, I think, in a short period of time for them to get over for this to happen.
Well, and I want to stick with the topic of debates because I think next week we have the vice presidential debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. The first time these two will be face-to-face on the national stage. I think many people obviously see this as a make-or-break moment, but I guess there's the question of how much do these VP debates matter, and what can we expect to see next week?
Yeah, well, I think you make a good point that there is this question of how much this matters. I think certainly a lot of people will be watching, maybe not as many people as watched the Harris-Trump debate, but certainly I think something that maybe adds to the importance is the fact that there is no second debate on the calendar between Harris and Trump. That could lend some more importance if there's a big moment in this Walz-Vance debate, if one candidate really stumbles or has some kind of gaffe, if another one really seems to come out on top, maybe that resonates with voters a bit, but ultimately voters are voting for the candidate at the top of the ticket. They're either voting for Trump, they're voting for Harris, and a lot of what is said at these VP debates is just attack lines going at the person at the top of the ticket anyway. Certainly, I think on the Republican side, you can expect to hear J.D. Vance attack Tim Walz over his military service, something that we've heard him do before, criticizing Walz for leaving the Army National Guard to run for office before his unit shipped out overseas. Walz will certainly attack the Harris ticket, the Harris-Walz ticket, as sort of an extension of the Biden administration. And then on the other side, Tim Walz has sort of telegraphed what we'll hear from him, which is attacks on the Trump-Vance ticket over Project 2025, arguing that this agenda will restrict abortion access, that it'll raise costs for Americans. And I wouldn't be surprised if we hear Tim Walz return to this line about J.D. Vance being weird, Donald Trump being weird, sort of put Tim Walz on the map, and I wouldn't be surprised if we hear him deploy that line at the debate.
Well, and I think it'll be interesting because I think this is the first time a number of Americans, even though they've seen Tim Walz and J.D. Vance, they'll really get to see them in action and maybe get to know them in a light that's very much under pressure. So we will have to see. Brett Samuels, as always, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks, Julia.
My observation is that basically the parties involved want it to go away. We have enough information to suggest that we really ought to try to figure this out and see if everything's okay or not. And I don't think we've done that yet.
That was exposure expert Stephen Petty speaking exclusively to NewsNation about what he's seen in East Palestine, Ohio since that toxic train derailment over a year and a half ago. The derailment in February of 2023 spilled hundreds of thousands of gallons of toxic chemicals. In the days following, local officials burned the contents of 5 derailed cars that were carrying vinyl chloride. The effects of that burn are what Petty says are being covered up. For more on his exclusive story, we're being joined by NewsNation investigative correspondent Rich McHugh. Rich, thank you so much for joining us. Stephen Petty has been on the ground in East Palestine, Ohio, collecting data since that burn, but he says he can't release that data because of an NDA. Let's take a look at what he told you.
I'm under a confidentiality and in terms of really what I know about what I did or what I evaluated.
This is a risk for you, speaking out.
Oh yeah, of course.
So Rich, what information has Petty been able to release?
So here's what we know. I caught up with Stephen Petty in February of 2023, just days after the derailment and burn. And I caught up with him while he was sampling. And I know that he sampled a number of homes, many homes, and other areas throughout East Palestine. He provided all of that information to the law firm that he was retained by, that later became the lead plaintiff's attorney in the class action lawsuit. So he provided his data and analysis, it's my understanding, analysis of other data to class counsel, the attorneys for the class action. They have all this data. The residents whose homes were tested and soils were tested, nobody's gotten the results. So there's a pool of data and analysis that the attorneys have that he cannot release himself because he's under confidentiality agreement.
So Rich, these are some pretty serious accusations against the EPA and his new release affidavit. I want to take a listen to that.
So you believe the EPA has obfuscated data or the facts in certain cases related to East Palestine?
I do. They're not being fully transparent with what the raw data likely says.
So Rich, why is Petty speaking out now?
I think there's 2 reasons he's speaking out, Julia. Here's what he told me. Somewhere along the way, this past spring, the plaintiff's attorneys for those in favor of this settlement introduced a new scientist, a toxicologist by the name of Dr. Arch Carson. And I'm going to paraphrase here, but he came out in a highly produced video that aired in and around East Palestine. He said, there is essentially nothing to see here. That got Petty really upset. And he said, look, we don't know that that's in fact true. Where are your receipts for when you say that? And furthermore, you're a toxicologist. You are not someone who analyzes exposure to a community. That is what I do. And if you know anything about Petty, he's the preeminent guy in this field in the country, if not the world. And his data is sitting, not being shared. The second reason is he came forward because there's another independent testing expert by the name of Scott Smith who has been testing all along. And he's been watching Petty has been watching from the sidelines, and he realizes that Smith has been smeared by both the EPA and PR associated with the class action attorneys and saying he's a fake scientist. We know this through FOIA documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act. So Petty came forward. He's like, look, I came forward because I've seen the data that Smith has, and it's sound. Personally, I think it's another way that he can come out and say, I can't talk about my data, but I can talk about that data, and that data shows high levels of dioxins, which goes against the EPA narrative and all the narratives, and that data is sound.
So staying with that data, in your interview, Petty did say he would release his data if ordered to by a judge. But should that happen, would it help the residents of East Palestine at this point, or has the damage already been done?
Look, I think anytime that you release more information and be more transparent, it will be helpful to the entire community. And this entire community has been through so much. They've been lied to at every turn by virtually every group that has come in and promised to help. And so here in this situation, there is data that, I believe, and most of them believe, could help them. Yes, damage has been done that it's gotten to this point, but there is a chance that his data being released could stop this settlement. A lot of the residents in that town, frankly, I haven't talked to one resident who's in favor of this settlement. It's not to say they're not there. There probably are, but the residents that I've spoken to are not in favor of this. They want this data. They want it released. And they say, why are you not being transparent? The EPA, why are you not being transparent? Release this data. Class action attorneys, release this data so we can all make an informed judgment. If we see nothing there and there is nothing to see here, then we will move on. But let us have the facts. That's their position. I think if this judge were to do that, I think it would do a lot of good for this community.
Yeah, this community has obviously already been through so much over the past, year and a half. So we'll see what information they end up getting. NewsNation investigative correspondent Rich McHugh, I know you've been on this story. Our partners at NewsNation have been doing great work in East Palestine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Julia. Appreciate it very much.
A new bipartisan bill in the Senate would have an impact on how you use social media. The Stop the Scroll Act, introduced Tuesday, would force social media platforms to display warning labels about mental health. Under the new bill, users would see a pop-up developed by the FTC and Surgeon General each time they logged on. Users would have to specifically dismiss the label before continuing to the site. It's not a new proposal. The Surgeon General has called for the label in the past, and just this month, a group of 42 attorneys generals asked Congress to act. All but one of a group of former President Trump supporters in Texas are in the clear after a federal jury rejected voter intimidation allegations connected to an incident involving a Biden-Harris campaign bus back in 2020. That incident happened during a trip from San Antonio to Austin in late October of 2020. A group of cars and trucks waving Trump flags boxed in the bus on the interstate, forcing it to slow down to about 15 miles per hour. 6 people in the so-called Trump train were sued. Only one was found liable in order to pay a total of $40,000 in damages. No criminal charges were filed. An attorney for the only member found liable said they would appeal. The late, great Johnny Cash now has a new home at the U.S. Capitol. A statue of the Man in Black revealed Tuesday will replace one of the 2 statues representing Cash's home state of Arkansas in the Capitol. The other depicts civil rights leader Daisy Bates, who mentored the 9 black children who desegregated Little Rock Central High School in 1957. Cash's statue was commissioned by a sculptor from Little Rock and depicts the singer with a guitar slung across his back and a Bible in his hand. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.